Any attempt at a military solution of the problem of the Korean Peninsula will lead to a tragedy on a colossal scale, huge casualties for all conflicting parties, humanitarian, economic, and an environmental catastrophe.
Обстановка в Центральной Азии остается нестабильной. Продолжается вооруженный конфликт в Афганистане между правительственными силами и боевиками движения «Талибан» и ИГИЛ. Командование военного округа уделяет особое внимание реализации совместных практических мероприятий с вооруженными силами стран Центральной Азии, что способствует укреплению позиции России в данном регионе. Основными задачами Восточного военного округа являются наращивание боевого состава войск, повышение качества их подготовки, а также перевооружение соединений и воинских частей. В этих целях в текущем году в округе осуществляется плановая оптимизация организационной штатной структуры. Продолжается плановая реализация программы перевооружения. До конца года войска получат свыше 1100 единиц новой и модернизированной техники. За первое полугодие принято на службу.
The United States and Japan have issued a joint statement after their latest security talks. The two countries' foreign and defense chiefs met in Washington on Thursday for their first 2+2 security meeting since Donald Trump became U.S. president. They reaffirmed their commitment to their bilateral alliance and said they would pursue more forms of cooperation. And they also said they would continue to put pressure on the DPRK to halt its nuclear and missile programs.
At this first 2+2 conference since the beginning of the Trump administration, we were able to reaffirm the strong commitment of the United States and Japan, the strong commitment to the region, which is extremely significant. On North Korea, towards its denuclearization, we agreed we would ramp up effective pressure.
North Korea's recent intercontinental ballistic missile and other missile launches are unacceptable provocations, and they must stop immediately. We agreed to bolster our alliance capabilities to deter and respond to North Korea's unacceptable behavior and other challenges to regional security.
Officials from the US and Japan have met in Washington to discuss the threat from North Korea. Japanese Defense Minister Itsunori Onodera and Foreign Minister Taro Kono, along with US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Defense Secretary James Mattis, agreed to work more closely together as fears grow over North Korea's nuclear capabilities.
We agreed to bolster our alliance capabilities to deter and respond to North Korea's unacceptable behavior and other challenges to regional security.
Tillerson said the US is keen to initiate a meaningful dialogue with Pyongyang, but made clear his belief that diplomacy must be backed up with military options. With regards to the denuclearization of North Korea, we agreed we would ramp up effective pressure. We will call on China to take specific measures to make North Korea change its behavior. On the threat of ballistic missiles, as an alliance we will strengthen our defense and capabilities to respond. Tensions in East Asia remain high following months of missile testing in North Korea. The secretive regime threatened to strike the US Pacific territory of Guam last week, but leader Kim Jong-un appears to have decided to hold off on his plans for the time being.
Meanwhile, America's top general is warned of devastating consequences should conflict break out on the Korean Peninsula, but stressed the issue could be resolved peacefully. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, made the remarks during a 3-day visit to China, where he also met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Eugene He reports.
The Pentagon's top general, Joseph Dunford, told reporters on Thursday that a military solution to North Korea's missile threat will be, quote, horrific. He added, however, that allowing Pyongyang to develop the capability to launch a nuclear attack on the U.S. was also an unimaginable situation. Dunford's comments indicate that although Washington would still prefer a diplomatic solution to the crisis, it will not stand idly by while the regime continues with its nuclear and missile developments. The U.S. general has just wrapped up a 3-day visit to China, where he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, holding brief but in-depth talks on regional security issues. President Xi said Beijing was committed to forging closer military ties as a step toward improving overall bilateral relations. Dunford also made a rare visit to the China-North Korea border, where he discussed contingency plans with Chinese military officials in case of a conflict with North Korea. Several roadblocks separate the two sides, however, with China still upset over the U.S. deployment of the THAAD missile defense system in South Korea and its military activity in the South China Sea. Dunford also informed Beijing the U.S. will proceed with its joint military exercise with South Korea next week, despite pressure to cancel the drills in light of recent tensions. Washington and Seoul have always insisted their biannual exercise is purely defensive in nature, although Pyongyang labels it as a military provocation. On Thursday, North Korea state-run media warned the joint drills will further push the Korean peninsula towards catastrophe.
Some of the most senior U.S. officials, including President Trump himself, insist military action is still an option when dealing with North Korea. But many others, including White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, says that is not realistically the case. There are also sources pointing out Washington might even consider reducing its military presence in the region. Connie Kim delves deeper into the conflicting reports.
The U.S. stressed that using military force against North Korea is still an option on the table, despite comments made by President Trump's chief strategist Steve Bannon, who admitted there is no military solution to North Korea's nuclear threats. Speaking to reporters during his trip to China, General Joe Dunford, the chair of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned Washington has credible, viable military options for dealing with Pyongyang. This was also echoed by top senior U.S. officials following the U.S.-Japan security meetings, while Secretary of State Tillerson declined to comment directly to Bannon's comments.
We are prepared. We're prepared militarily. We're prepared with our allies to respond if that is necessary. That is not our preferred pathway, and that's been made clear as well.
Together, we will deter and, if necessary, defeat any threat. Any initiation of hostilities will be met with an effective and overwhelming response.
Steve Bannon told progressive website American Prospect earlier this week that until someone solves how 10 million people in Seoul don't die in the first 30 minutes from conventional weapons, there is no military solution to North Korea's nuclear threats. Bannon's remarks sent shockwaves as they go against Trump's threat of countering North Korea's provocations with fire and fury. And although a remote measure, the possibility of removing U.S. troops from the Korean peninsula, North Korea's longtime demand, was one option Bannon could consider in a deal with China. While this wouldn't be the first time the option of withdrawing U.S. forces from South Korea comes as an option, South Korean government officials kept note of the fact that the comments came from one of Trump's closest aides, with diplomatic sources keeping an eye on a possible undisclosed North Korea-U.S. meeting on scaling down the annual Seoul-Washington joint military exercises in exchange for the regime's changed behavior. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
Yesterday, Secretary Tillerson rejected that notion. Listen.
I don't really have a comment on what Mr. Bannon's remarks were. We have been quite clear as to what the policy and the posture towards North Korea is. We are prepared. We're prepared militarily. We're prepared with our allies to respond if that is necessary. That is not our preferred pathway. It is only prudent that they fully understand the consequences should they make a bad choice.
And meanwhile, North Korea's new propaganda posters are boasting that the U.S. is within strike range of its missiles. Joining us right now, Eurasia Group Asia Director Meredith Supter. Meredith, thanks very much for joining the conversation. Your thoughts on the latest tensions here?
Absolutely. I think you need to be watching what the President's defense chiefs as well as the Secretary of State are saying. All military options are always on the table, but they're stressing that it is the defensive nature of the military option that they're considering here. The Trump administration is going to focus on the diplomatic pressure strategy to force Pyongyang back to the negotiating table, and that's what we expect over the next 6 to 12 months.
So, Meredith, it's baffling to me how an advisor to the president could undercut the president by basically saying one of his key leverage points is off the table, and yet I suppose it raises a question. I mean, is Steve Bannon onto something here? I mean, is it the case that really there are very few legitimate military options to deal with North Korea, given the proximity to Seoul, given the proximity to other allies in the region?
Absolutely. The barriers to the military option are very high. And I should note that Steve Bannon was speaking off the cuff to the reporter, and it wasn't an official interview. So again, the administration is going to focus on the diplomatic strategy to force North Korea back to the negotiating table and to build leverage over North Korea through application of sanctions and other means of applying economic pressure. And the game here is to get as much leverage over Pyongyang as possible so that when you do sit down at the table, you have the ability to force an endgame that is in the U.S. interest.
Meredith, between the sanctions that were just passed at the UN and North Korea very publicly kind of backing off its threat to Guam, would you say that Trump's policy on North Korea has been a success so far?
Look, it's going to take some time for that policy to play out. And certainly the challenge here is that the application of economic sanctions over the course of the last couple of decades have not deterred Pyongyang from its ultimate goal of obtaining an ICBM that could have the ability to strike the United States with a nuclear-tipped warhead. So Pyongyang has shown no indication that it is interested at all at negotiating away the one thing that it believes protects its regime from being overthrown. And from our side, from the U.S. side and that of our allies in the region, the military option is indeed horrific and something that the military chiefs want to only consider as an ultimate last resort and as a defensive measure. So really, when we look at the long game here, we are beginning to see the strategy evolve towards a potential for a deterrence and containment strategy. Now, this is not something that the White House is talking about, but it's something that the policy experts and the think tanks in the field are beginning to discuss, realizing that there are no good options on the table, and that the military option is really not one that any of the parties want to deploy.
All right, we will leave it there. Meredith, thanks very much for your